Story 1. Just 22 hours ago, our manufactured home in northeast Arkansas was hit by a tornado. The house doesn't have a basement, and we don't have a storm shelter, so we were all huddled in the hallway. As the tornado hit, we could feel the house literally lifting off the ground beneath us. Story 2. When I was 10, I was on a ride called the Whip at a carnival when the belt popped loose, and I fell out of the car. I was hanging on to the edge while the operator was not paying attention. Everyone was screaming, but I was too scared to speak up. Finally, the operator shut the ride down. I clanged around a bit and got some bumps and bruises, but I was glad to be alive. My mom had to be held back from confronting the operator. Story 3. There was a shooting at my high school when I was in 11th grade. I'm grateful that I was hiding in a classroom and not getting shot at. Still, hiding and listening to screams and gunshots in the distance, not knowing who was hurt or if they would find me next, is terrifying. For several years, I looked for hiding spots everywhere I went. Story 4. When my daughter got stung by a Portuguese man-o-war, she was going into shock from the pain and screaming, "I don't want to die." It was the worst few hours of my life, and I'm sure it was the same for her. Story 5. When my husband took our son to the park, he called me 10 minutes later, screaming and crying, saying our son had been hit by a car. Our son was only 18 months old and in a stroller, struck by someone who was not paying attention. During those 30 seconds of screaming and confusion, as I hurried to put on my shoes, I had no idea if my son was dead or alive. It was the most terrified I have ever been in my life. Fortunately, my son is okay, but recalling that frantic moment is still very triggering. Story 6. I used to sell drugs, ketamine, ecstasy, weed, and more. One of my best customers was a house full of young ravers. One night, I received a call asking me to bring ketamine. Upon arrival, I was greeted by a small girl who answered the door nude and covered in blood. I could see several deep cuts on her arms and across her chest. Despite this, she was smiling and happy to see me. I asked where the other two girls who lived there were, and I was led to the bathroom. The other two were in the empty bathtub, slicing into each other's arms and legs with a broken razor. They were making sounds as if they were having sex while they were being cut. There was blood everywhere, the ceiling, the walls, even the dog. I managed to take the razors away from them and alerted the one other roommate in the house. He helped me clean the girls off and called a friend with emergency medical training. He showed up with basic supplies, and I learned to sew skin together that night. Later, after they sobered up a bit, we found out they had spent a week binging on LSD and a mix of prescriptions. They never really explained how they ended up cutting each other. I quit selling drugs a few days later. Story 7. Realizing my mom was dying and that I was alone with her in a different province during a global pandemic, I did not know if sending her away in an ambulance would be the last time I would see her. Story 8. I was in the remote backcountry of Olympic National Park. I slipped on a log I was using to cross a fast and cold river. I almost fell in. I'm not sure how I didn't. I badly dislocated my finger. We still had 3 days of trekking to get back to the car. There was a very low chance that my trekking partner would have been able to rescue me, and their chances of finding help were also unlikely. Story 9. My younger sister had a stomach bug and was absolutely terrified of throwing up. When I got home, she was on the couch screaming for help, saying she couldn't breathe. I sat next to her, and she was completely stiff, unable to move her hands. I was panicking as she yelled at me for help, saying she couldn't move or breathe. We called an ambulance. Apparently, she had such a severe panic attack over throwing up that she couldn't get enough oxygen to her brain. Story 10. The night my mom went missing, no one believed me that something was wrong since she lived far away from us. However, she would always respond within a few minutes if you texted her. I couldn't get in touch with her for hours. I spent 12 hours terrified that something horrible had happened to my mom. I was right. She was found dead the next morning. For weeks after that, I would have a panic attack if anyone took more than 30 seconds to respond to a text message. Story 11. Crashing upside down into floodwaters and being swept under a bridge. The driver's side door would not open. The passenger side door was our escape route. It was a frightening time with fast-flowing water. She didn't know how to swim, but we made it out to call her parents for assistance. The house next to the floodwaters was very helpful in getting us help. Story 12. I was 18 when I drove alone in the dark following a vehicle accident that killed my 15-year-old sister and 13-year-old brother. My sister was behind the wheel, driving fast on country roads, and neither of them had seatbelts on. They crashed in a wheat field. My sister was gone, and my brother was dying. I am over 40 now and still experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. My oldest son just got his driver's license. Story 13. My brother and I got stuck on a malfunctioning carnival roller coaster ride. Started slowing and lunging, then just stopped on the track. We were stuck sideways and partially upside down. We were also in elementary school, very slim, and starting to slide through the loose safety restraints keeping us in our seats. We were both screaming and searching for places to fall that we might survive. It was about a 30 to 40-foot drop, and there was nothing but more tracks or hard ground below us. All the blood was rushing to my head, and I remember wondering if my parents would bury my brother and me next to each other. He was younger than me and squeezing my hand tightly while crying. I will never forget the genuine look of fear on his face, and I'm sure I had the same expression. After what seemed like an eternity, they somehow managed to unlock whatever was holding us in place and move the cars to a position on the track where we were no longer hanging upside down. We were then guided to an emergency exit. I heard that someone in one of the seats behind us fainted, but I didn't turn around to look. I've never moved faster in my life to get my feet on solid ground. This was in the early 1990s at a state fair. Occasionally it comes up, but my brother and I have never really talked about it. We survived, and that was enough. Story 14. Watching my dad abuse my mom as a child was traumatic. He almost shot her at point-blank range while she was on her hands and knees trying to withstand the beating and missed. I was just a few feet away. My uncle murdered a family member, and I was home alone when he called me first. I almost died from dehydration in Colorado one winter while I was alone with no phone and no car. The neighborhood experienced riots. I nearly did a photo shoot at an old warehouse for a man who I later discovered was involved in a murder. He was arrested, and I thought he was ignoring my calls. I have survived some pretty wild experiences. Story 15. I witnessed a dangerous patient at the psychiatric hospital where I work attack a nurse, and I had to intervene to stop the assault. I previously worked as a security guard and am currently employed by the hospital as the head janitor. Story 16. My ex held a butcher knife to my throat while my children were in the other room. Luckily, I dialed 911 when he went to the kitchen to get the knife, so they heard everything and many police officers arrived a few minutes later. Story 17. As a child, I woke in the middle of a bad storm and looked out the window. I saw a glowing figure peeking back at me from behind a tree in the yard. I ran to my parents' room to wake them up, almost hyperventilating. When they both said they would go look, I didn't want them to leave me because I thought they would die. My dad went to check it out and took a long time to come back, which made me nearly inconsolable. My mom was now frightened by how scared I was. Eventually, he returned, laughing. I had poor eyesight, so what I really saw through the blurry, torrential rain was a human man. Glowing? No, he was a lineman in a yellow high-visibility suit, working on the power pole and lines that had fallen during the storm. The way his partner was shining a bright light to see what they were doing, coupled with how he was standing by a tree and working, made it look like something was peeking out from hiding. I had also just watched Scooby-Doo, Cyberchase. Just imagine a yellow version of that villain was what I thought was out there. Story 18. The night I woke up to a tornado roaring outside and the mobile home bouncing on its pillars was the only time I panicked. Nothing bad happened. How the trailer survived without damage is unknown. It took years before I could stay inside when I heard any wind without having to go outside and check the sky, even on cloudless days. Story 19. In high school, a friend of mine claimed he could drive like the characters from Fast and Furious. I never took him seriously, but one day he and two other friends were driving down a back road, and he was speeding about 70 miles per hour on a curvy road. He hit a patch of gravel from a driveway during a turn and lost control. I was in the front passenger seat, and I knew we were about to roll over. We slid for what felt like an eternity, and the only thing that prevented us from rolling was that we eventually slid down a straight stretch of road. If it hadn't straightened out, we would have landed in the ditch and flipped. It was his mother's Mustang, and he damaged the tires in the process. I almost punched him, but instead, I ripped his radio out of the dashboard. When his drag race song came on, he felt the need to put our lives at risk. Story 20. Wandering through a hayfield, I stumbled into a marijuana grow operation. I was 16, and the next thing I knew, we were at gunpoint in front of a group of very angry bikers. I didn't know whether I was about to panic or if the guy next to me actually did, but he must have felt something because he lowered his rifle and said, "You boys better get out of here." Oh boy, I ran faster than Forrest Gump. Story 21. Swimming under the shrimp boat, cutting a rope off the prop and getting rammed and bumped by large objects I couldn't see. Story 22. I have blacked out in terror several times in a psychological domestic violence scenario. It has been a difficult decade. Story 23. I was walking home from the post office when I noticed a group of about 5 men ahead of me. 2 were sitting on a bench and the other 3 were standing facing them. They were somewhat split, 3 on one side and 2 on the other, on the small sidewalk. As I approached, they saw me coming and started shouting inappropriate comments. I had no choice but to pass through them. There was no way around to get home. I felt uneasy as I got closer and tried to ignore them without making eye contact. As I passed, one of them yelled, "We are going to ride you, girl." Instinctively, I began running. I didn't look back until I had run at least 3 or 4 streets away. I wasn't sure if they tried to follow me. I kept running until my chest felt like it was burning. I realized in my panic that I had lost track of what street I was on, so I called a ride service. The driver turned out to be a woman, and I told her what had happened. She assured me that she would ensure I got out of there safely. Story 24. When delivering my daughter, the doctor had to cut her umbilical cord while she was still inside me because it was wrapped around her neck. He advised me to hurry. It took over 4 minutes to deliver her after he broke her collarbones. She was discolored from a lack of oxygen, and they rushed out of the delivery room with her. She still showed signs of discoloration the next day. Story 25. 2 men were arguing outside my apartment when I was about 16. The situation escalated, and I saw through the window that they were pushing each other and yelling. I was holding the apartment door closed while one man was being stabbed to death against it. The assailant then tried to break into the door that I was pressing my full weight against to keep shut. It felt like hours that I struggled to keep it closed, hoping they wouldn't find me alone inside. Eventually, police lights appeared, and one man ran away. I still remember the sound of the door banging, and sometimes when I hear a noise like that, it triggers flashbacks, leaving me unable to stop shaking. Story 26. Someone in a large truck tried to run me off the road into a telephone pole and then attempted to drive right next to me. I thought he was going to harm me if he didn't run me off the road. Defensive driving saved my life. Story 27. When I was 15, I was walking home alone, talking on the phone with my mom. It was about midnight, and there was nobody around when a truck pulled up beside me. A man got out and started walking quickly behind me, but when I turned my head to look at him and he saw I was on the phone, he ran back to his vehicle and drove away. As he passed me, I noticed he had a mattress in the bed of his truck. It scared me. Story 28. When I was on the streets using meth, I felt held hostage and assaulted by a much stronger person. I was completely strung out and weighed about 120 pounds, but I managed to get away. A few months later, I saw that person at the grocery store, and a wave of fear like nothing I had ever experienced washed over me. It was, in some ways, more intense than during the actual assault. Story 29. My brother and I were e-scootering around El Paso on a road trip. We zoomed into an abandoned-looking train yard, but our scooters stopped working, so we got off to explore. A sketchy, shirtless man appeared out of nowhere, circling us and looking around, clearly aware that no one else was nearby, with his hand deep in his pocket as if he was holding something. He was getting closer, and I started to panic. about to tell my brother we should retreat to the sidewalk when a white van pulled up. It was the e-scooter company. A friendly employee popped out and said, "Hey, looks like your scooters ran out of battery. I have replacements for you if you want to keep going." The sketchy guy quickly skittered away. To this day, I believe the scooter employee prevented something really bad from happening. I still feel a wave of adrenaline just thinking about that. Story 30. Right now, we have set a date to put my dog to sleep, and I am terrified about the decision. It is logically the right choice, but I can't imagine a life without her as part of it. Story 31. When my child was born 5 weeks early and couldn't breathe on his own, it terrified me to my core. Years later, he is a healthy, spirited toddler who is always getting into trouble. I love it. Story 32. I was waiting for an elevator when a young man joined me. The elevator was taking a long time, and suddenly, I felt an instinct telling me not to take it. I headed for the stairs and started running. I heard someone running down the steps, and out of the corner of my eye, I saw the young man who had been waiting for the elevator with me. I kept running until I exited the building and reached a busy area. Maybe it was nothing, but I didn't want to find out the hard way. Story 33. Waking up in the middle of the night to tornado sirens and running to a dark basement as debris hit the side of our house during a tornado was terrifying. Seeing the downed tree next to the house was also alarming. It just barely missed the house and could have caused significant damage. Story 34. After catching a man watching me multiple times over a year, he attempted to break in. That was frightening. The police scared him off. I moved. Story 35. My youngest son turned blue when he was a few months old. He choked on his acid reflux and couldn't swallow it down. It was absolutely horrifying. The doctors finally listened to me about the problem, though. I was so frustrated that it took them so long to take me seriously. The same son, now 2 years old, decided to play hide and seek from me a couple of months ago. He kept changing spots, and I was unaware he knew how to do this. I ran through the house frantically, checking every single spot multiple times and couldn't find him. I ended up calling emergency services, and while I was on the phone giving details, I crumbled to the floor trying to communicate without crying. That's when I heard him, under my bed. I had checked there 3 times already. He had his hands covering his mouth and broke out into a huge smile. He was so proud of himself. I told the dispatcher, and he sounded more annoyed than anything. I cannot describe how terrified I was that he'd somehow gotten out of the house, even though I was near the door when he went to hide and there are 2 child locks on it. I don't know. The mind goes wild when you can't find your baby. He'll be the reason for my gray hairs. Story 36. In 2023, after the Allen Outlet Mall shooting, teenagers in the mall I worked at, which was 7 miles from the outlets, decided to yell "gun," causing everyone to panic and run screaming. I was working and could usually hear screams of joy or laughter from kids in the mall, but the difference between happy screams and scared screams is something I will never forget. I also will never forget the look I gave my coworker. We just knew we had to get out. I had to hide about 20 customers in what was essentially a broom closet. We thought we were going to die. This was 4 hours after 8 people lost their lives, 7 miles away from us. There were reports of multiple shooters, so we were already discussing how one could show up at our mall. We ran through the back corridors and out of the mall, leaving everything behind. We had no cell phones or car keys. We jumped into a stranger's pickup truck and told him to drive. I'm still in therapy for it to this day. The fact that there were teenagers who thought it would be okay to do that 4 hours after the Allen shooting makes me lose hope in humanity. Story 37. Caught in a landslide in Pakistan. I crawled on my knees above a raging river in the rain and slippery clay mud to escape. My heart still thumps when I think about it. Story 38. When I was assaulted while pregnant, it sent me into preterm labor during the delivery, where my son and I almost died. Story 39. Being locked in a drug dealer's room at 16 years old for about 4 to 5 days. I saw blood dripping from the ceiling. Story 40. I was assaulted recently. I don't know when because I have blocked it out. I have no idea what he looked like now. Somehow, he managed to stop my security camera from working while he was here. I don't know if I was the most terrified. I feel more terrified now because I don't have access to the memory apart from knowing it happened. I remember him going outside for a cigarette while I sat on my bed wondering how to possibly get him away from my house. I am in a vulnerable profession, so I am always at risk. It isn't like I wasn't going to be having intimate encounters with this man. I just wasn't expecting the violence or the lack of protection. It meant I had to get tested for everything possible. I don't know how long ago it was. I want to say maybe 6 months. The smallest amount of stress the other day while I was talking to my dentist made me burst into tears. It was so humiliating. Story 41. When I received a call from my mother-in-law informing me that my son had been hurt, I broke down in tears. A nurse then came on the line and asked if the hospital had permission to treat my son. When I asked what was wrong with him, she said they couldn't tell me because they didn't know how badly he was hurt. Story 42. I went off a cliff on a bus in Myanmar while driving from Rakhine back to Yangon in the mountains. I was asleep in the back middle seat when I was jolted awake by a huge bump. The next thing I knew, I was airborne, flying through the middle of the bus while it was spinning around me. I was getting hit with bags and bodies, and the bus crashed onto its side and started sliding. I had broken glass all over me, and as we slid over the bamboo, it was ripping the skin off my arm. We stopped, pointing downhill about 10 feet from an even steeper 300-foot drop. We couldn't escape from the bus and thought we were completely isolated. Our phones didn't have service. After about 20 minutes, some locals pulled us out, but I was badly injured by the glass. I was very grateful to have butterfly bandages that day. Once we reached the top, we were all bloodied and bruised, most of us missing our shoes, bags, and passports. An almost empty coach bus with a family picked us up and took us back to Yangon. When we hit the border of Rakhine, the military asked for our passports, which we obviously didn't have. They held us there for a long time until someone pulled up a news article in Burmese about a bus accident involving foreigners and the driver fleeing. The military lined us all up against a wall. We didn't know what was happening. Eventually, they came and started taking selfies with us. We got back on the bus severely shaken. As we were pulling away, they stopped the bus again, came on board, and gave us a big bottle of whiskey. Story 43. My 3-week-old daughter spit up in her car seat, aspirated, stopped breathing, and I watched my husband perform CPR on her in the back of our SUV. I cried quietly, thinking this was the end. We struggled with infertility, and she was an absolute miracle. I thought, of course, we don't get to keep her. Just our luck. She is 4 years old now, and that memory haunts me daily. I live with a painful internal fear of my children being taken from me. You would never know from the outside how deeply affected I was after witnessing that and then sitting by her side in the hospital for days. I refused to sleep. I just watched her. I feel physically ill even writing this. Story 44. Commercial airliners turned into weapons on September 11, 2001, in New York City. Everyone thought a follow-up attack could happen at any moment for years. Story 45. My sister, my best friend, and I were camping for the weekend. On the second night, we were biking around the grounds and decided to walk a path in the woods. We were laughing and goofing around in the dark, deep in the woods around 1 a.m. My best friend was trying to take a picture of a spider web, and I remember teasing her because they are so hard to photograph. She pulled up the images to show us what she had captured, and we stood around, getting blinded by the light from the photo due to the darkness. Then it turned into scrolling through pictures from that day. I had a sudden instinct that someone was watching us, and when I looked up, I saw a man standing in the woods. I could see light reflecting off his glasses and noticed he was wearing a baseball cap. I gasped and said, "There's a man over there." My best friend immediately shined her phone light at him and charged towards him. She's quite brave and started shouting, "What are you doing? Why are you sneaking up on us?" There was no reason for him to be there, deep in the woods. He was standing off the path, watching silently. We had been there for a while, trying to take a picture of a spiderweb and scrolling through the day's photos. We got within about 4 feet of him, and he turned and ran off through the woods. We decided we couldn't go back to our campground because we didn't want to show him or end up being vulnerable. So we biked up to the ranger station, but no one was there that late. Then we biked around the campground for the rest of the night since there were only about 6 other campers in the whole place, and we didn't have a car. When morning came, we were relieved to finally tell the ranger, who said he was planning to kick the man out because we were the second complaint based on our description. We slept on the beach that day, and we literally biked for about 5 hours. Story 46. I was snowboarding at Whistler Blackham. It was very foggy at the top, and I couldn't see much. I was riding in an untracked area, alone. As I approached a slight uphill area while cutting across, I realized I was about to hit a drop-off. There were some large cliffs around, and I had no idea where I was. I tried to brake, but the next thing I knew, I was falling. In that moment, I thought I was headed towards a significant drop. It turned out to be about a 30-foot drop. In that moment, when I believed I was plummeting to my death, I answered the question of what my last words would be, as I said them aloud. Not good. Not good. Not good. No. Story 47. I grew up alone with a paranoid schizophrenic parent who refused treatment. It was terrifying. She would scratch at my door and make animal growling noises, move the furniture away from the wall, and put her ear to the wall, telling me about all the conversations they were having. She would lock the doors and refuse to let me leave or turn on the lights. The expressions on her face and her eyes sometimes didn't even look human. I could go on and on. When I think about this part of my life, it is one huge, horrific memory. I went through a lot of therapy with an amazing person to work through it. That is the only reason I got out of it alive. Story 48. My 1-year-old had an anaphylactic reaction and swelled up so fast that I dialed 911. He couldn't open his eyes and started wheezing. It was horrible to witness. We administered the epinephrine autoinjector, and the ambulance arrived, taking him for his first ride to the hospital. To this day, he is almost 4 years old, and we still don't know what caused that reaction. He didn't eat anything new that day. I thought I was going to lose my baby that day. Story 49. I was struck in the face by a Tinder date I didn't know, in a city I was unfamiliar with, on an empty street in the dead of night as he was walking me back to my car. My fight-or-flight instincts had never been so powerful. Story 50. The truck broke down 10 miles from home at 10 p.m. in January. I had to walk in blowing snow at -12 degrees Celsius, and for the last half of the trip, I was being paced by a cougar. I could hear it chuffing and yowling about 50 or 60 meters into the brush. The flashlight didn't help. It only illuminated the flying snow. Staying with the vehicle wasn't an option because there were animals that needed care back home. It was a very rural location before cell phones were common. There was only one other house between me and home, and nobody was there. No electricity or telephones were available that far out. Story 51. When a man almost landed on me while falling from a cliff above me at Cotterskill Falls. He survived after being airlifted out. Story 52. Watching a plane fly into the building where I worked, where my colleagues and a few close friends were inside, I soon thought the entire city and country were under attack. Story 53. This past hurricane season, I held my daughter as a tornado ripped through our backyard. Thankfully, it didn't hit our house, but it absolutely devastated the neighborhood next to ours. It was heartbreaking for all of them and shook me to my core. I've experienced hurricanes before, but tornadoes are what scare me the most. The uncertainty of them is jarring. Additionally, it was my first active hurricane season with my daughter. Not knowing what was going to happen and whether I'd be able to protect her was extremely terrifying for me. Story 54. Probably when I got lost in the woods at night for about 7 hours. It doesn't sound that scary, but I was on a hike and we took a wrong turn. It got dark fast and started snowing heavily. We were aimlessly running down a steep hill, and I fell and got impaled with a large stick. I couldn't continue, and I was vomiting from fear and exhaustion, so he left me there. Eventually, he found his car and I followed the honking, but I had never been so convinced I was going to die, just sitting there alone in the snow in the middle of bear country with a stick up my back. Story 55. When I experienced a bipolar psychosis episode in 2020, I felt like a passenger in my body and mind. There were blackouts and chaotic thoughts. I thought I was going to die for real. Story 56. I suffered a status seizure that lasted over 2 hours. I was conscious throughout the entire episode and was certain I was dying before finally getting help. It was my first known seizure, and I am a newly diagnosed epileptic. Story 57. My wife and I were moving with our 10-month-old daughter to Alaska. Somewhere within the last 100 miles of our drive, a bad snowstorm came through while it was dark. We approached a steep hill, and as we were descending, the trailer we were hauling started to fishtail. Luckily, I was able to regain control, but I have never been more terrified in my life. I still feel anxious driving in the snow with my daughter or wife to this day. Story 58. I had a cesarean, and immediately upon going home, I did not feel well. I called my doctor 2 to 3 times a day, telling him I had unusual seepage that smelled bad. I felt feverish but didn't have a fever, and I was vomiting. He told me it was just because I was overweight and it was my first cesarean. I went in for my 1-week follow-up appointment. Again, he insisted it was all in my head and that I was just overweight. I became hysterical, and he sent me to a woman surgeon in his group, thinking she would calm me down because she was a woman. Within 15 minutes of being in her office, I was wrapped in absorbent pads and a plastic sheet. My newborn was handed to me, and I was told to nurse her, keeping in mind it might be the last time because I was going into emergency surgery. It was the scariest moment of my life. It turned out I had necrotizing fasciitis in my cesarean wound, caused by flesh-eating bacteria. Due to its placement, they expected me to die. After multiple surgeries, a wound vacuum, and 6 months of recovery, my daughter is now 17 and makes jokes about being the youngest, feeling so strongly about her birth order that she joked she would do anything to maintain that position. I will never forget holding her in my arms and the sound of the plastic crinkling around us. Story 59. My top 2 experiences. 1. My husband and I were driving through Raton Pass between New Mexico and Colorado when a storm hit. I couldn't see anything around us but had to keep driving because the road is so narrow and has only 1 lane in both directions, with no place to pull off. The only thing I could see were the tail lights of a semi-truck in front of us. I gripped the wheel tightly, and we made it through. I was shaking so badly that we didn't talk for almost an hour. That's when I realized I was still white-knuckling the steering wheel. When our apartment caught on fire, I had gone to take a nap while my husband had his headphones in, watching a video. Someone started banging on the door, which startled him. They alerted him to the fire. I woke up because I heard what sounded like rocks being thrown at our window. I smelled smoke, but I thought it was just the space heater. Then he ran in and yelled that we had to go because the apartment was on fire. The pets made it out, but the cat ran back in. It was nighttime and she is mostly black. With smoke billowing out of the doors and windows, I had little hope the firefighters would find her. But they did, and she is sleeping behind me on the couch now. That was a really scary night. I've been through a lot of frightening experiences myself, but they were all personal. These were the 2 times I was afraid I would lose those who mattered so much to me. Story 60. When my daughter became septic from pneumonia she caught after a surgery, she was only 6 weeks old. She was on the highest ventilator settings for a week straight. Everyone was worried she wasn't going to make it. She's 15 months old now and thriving, but it was a terrifying experience. The second significant event was when I was in a car accident in 2020. A 2004 Nissan Sentra collided with an 18-wheeler on the highway. Everyone walked away with bumps and bruises. I'm not religious, but it made me question my beliefs that night. I developed post-traumatic stress disorder from it. I couldn't drive on the highway without panicking or be near 18-wheelers without crying for years. I still dislike being near them. Story 61. I've had many experiences over the past 60 years. I have been raped 3 times, sexually abused, and almost died more than once, witnessing things no one should. In 2020, I was catatonic for 6 weeks. One night, after I came out of it, I was assaulted by 4 or 5 aides while I was sound asleep. My arms were held over my head, and my legs were held apart. One female certified nursing assistant was instructing them on what to do. Wash her. Scrub it. It was ice cold. They spoke about me as if I weren't there. I kept saying, "Stop. I'm awake. Don't do this. Let me go. I can wash myself." I looked up at the boy holding my arms, and he wouldn't look down at me. I told him he didn't have to participate. The female said, "Scream all you want. Nobody is coming, princess." It went on endlessly. Yes, this counts as assault. Yes, I reported it. No, nothing happened. Yes, I tried to sue. No lawyer would take the case because Dartmouth Hitchcock is too big. Now, I am afraid all the time. I can't shower unless someone is home. I can't sleep in the dark. I need the TV on. I no longer trust any medical professionals. I don't like technicians touching me. I am a mess. Story 62. I guess when I was 16, I was in the ocean at the Jersey Shore on a sandbar about ankle deep when the tide started to come in. I stepped down into waist-deep water, and as I walked toward the shore, I noticed several sharks, not great whites but possibly sand sharks, stuck in the waist-deep area between the sandbar and the shoreline. I think they were waiting for the tide to come in so they could swim out to deep sea beyond the sandbar. They were awfully close and getting closer. I was terrified I would be bitten, but I kept quiet and took a step, then stopped, proceeding like that until I was out of the water. I prayed with each step. At the time, I did not know that sharks are attracted to sound and erratic movement. Had I panicked and bolted or started screaming, I could have been in danger. Fun fact. At that time, the very cute lifeguard was entertaining some bikini-clad young ladies fawning over him. Story 63. When I was less experienced in backpacking, I took a solo trip to a subalpine lake. The lake was about 8 miles out. I had no bear spray, no means to defend myself, and no bear-safe food canister. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of an animal tearing into my food about 15 feet from my tent. My body went ice cold. My cortisol levels skyrocketed, and I realized there was nothing I could realistically do to defend myself or avoid the situation at that point. I still don't know what animal actually ripped into the food, but it managed to get a fair bit. I went home a few hours early. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.